Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. So I've read through a couple of pages in the free sample on Amazon of The Perfect Father, especially the part dealing with Shanann. So far I haven't really found a terrible amount that's new to me. Some of my patrons say the same thing, although they say the author does sort of round off things quite nicely. Some people have read through the whole book already, and that tends to be a good narrative. Any book that you read quickly tends to be well written. A book that you can't finish tends to be, for whatever reason, defective. It's either too long, or it's not very interesting, or it doesn't flow, right? One thing that I want to mention is I think there's a misperception that Chris Watts was very inexperienced with women. I'm not saying that's the misperception, but I think how the misperception goes is Chris Watts is very inexperienced with women, and Shanann kind of was different. Shanann was sort of normal. Shanann had quite a few relationships, kind of thing. I don't know if that's accurate. If you go into John Glatt's narrative, he talks about Shanann falling in love with Leonard King while she was still at school, and she married very young, and her friends were worried about this. The other thing is Shanann didn't really date at school. She didn't really have that many friends for a while, and then she did, but you didn't really kind of get the idea that she dated much. And then suddenly she met somebody, I think in high school, Leonard King, and then they got married. And, they got married so young that she sort of helped him get his law degree, and either dropped out of her own studies or sort of sacrificed so that he could get where he wanted to go, kind of thing. In any event, the marriage didn't work out. Not surprisingly, because they both married young, and Shanann didn't have that much experience. Who knows about Leonard King? Leonard King is kind of somebody that's maintained kind of I don't know if the word's a dignified silence or just a kind of a silence, but it's strange that we don't know about her life with him. And he doesn't seem to want to say anything about it. It would certainly be interesting if he came forward and gave us an insight into the other Shanann, the Shanann that he knew. Remember, someone that divorced him, or did he divorce her? Anyway, that would be an interesting thing. The point I'm trying to make is it kind of feels like, and I realize I'm sort of generalizing here. I realize it's maybe an oversimplification. But it kind of feels like Shanann had two serious relationships. She had her sort of that very early relationship with Leonard King, and she married that guy. And then she had a relationship with Chris Watts, and she had that relationship when she was very vulnerable. She'd sort of just been diagnosed with lupus, and she was about to quit her job. And Chris Watts seemed, I think, like a nice guy, a sweet guy, a kind guy. And I think she liked it. She wanted someone who wasn't going to be too pushy or too prickly. She wanted to be in control, and she was in control. But the point I'm trying to make is I think there's a misconception that Chris Watts was totally naive when it came to the opposite sex, and Shanann, it was different with her. She was quite experienced. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say Shanann had more experience than Chris Watts. I mean, bear in mind, Shanann had already been in a marriage. But I don't know if one can say two relationships count as a lot of experience with the opposite sex, right? Most people today, especially teenagers and so on, go through quite a few relationships with the opposite sex before they find out who they are, what they want in a partner, what their partners want in them. I guess I've got to be careful saying the opposite sex, because I think you know what I mean. Just in your partner. So it's not necessarily, I guess, the opposite sex. It could be, but anyway, you know what I mean. It's just in the person that you're with. In this case, in the Watts case, it's obviously people that are heterosexual, and so that applies. Just a final point to make in this area. I think the way that Shanann's relationship started with Leonard King and the way that it ended, I think may have echoed into her marriage with Chris Watts. In other words, I don't think she wanted to get divorced again. I think it was quite traumatic for her, and I think she probably felt, it's one thing to leave your husband when you have no children. It's another thing to sort of, it's a totally different kettle of fish when you're pregnant and you've got 2 children, and now you've got to sort of take that step. I think it takes a really, really strong person to do that. I actually know somebody who did do that, someone who had 2 children, and then I think she was pregnant, and then her husband was going to leave her. And this person that I knew was a very good sportswoman. She was a really good swimmer, and she kind of developed courage and confidence, I think, in a way through her body, through exercising, kind of in a way, the same way that Chris Watts did. He was also exercising. But just spending time training and, building mental resilience. I don't think she was doing it necessarily to cope with her marriage. It was just something she enjoyed doing. On the other hand, that may have been what was going on. But I'm just saying it has been done. Someone has achieved that. And Shanann seemed understandably quite anxious and quite terrified at the prospect of, I can't do this alone. I've got to make this work with Chris Watts. Before we start with this episode, I want to leave you with one additional thought in this area, and that thought is, can you imagine so let me put it in a different way. Let's say Chris Watts had the affair with Shanann, and somehow she didn't find out, and there were no murders or anything like that, and they stayed married. Do you think she would ever have cheated on him? Let me put it another way. If they had stayed together, she'd never gone to North Carolina, do you think the next year or the year after that or the year after that or the year after that Shanann might have been the one having the affair? And what I mean is, if you take away the murder, you take away Kessinger, and you just leave the Watts family in the situation that they were in, bear in mind Shanann is becoming more confident, she's losing more weight, but also the finances are deteriorating, and they may not be able to stay in their house. Shanann didn't seem terribly happy with Chris Watts. Like, I know she wanted to stay married to him, but remember, she also spoke to a divorce lawyer, was it in April, May, in that restaurant. That suggests she may have, if she felt she had a choice, she may have wanted to leave Chris Watts. All I'm saying is, can you imagine how different things would have been if Shanann had cheated on Chris Watts? What would have happened then? And do you think that she could have, I don't mean that she did cheat on him, but hypothetically, almost like going into the future, do you think that she could have cheated on him, losing weight, being, mixing with a lot of the other thrivers, going to sort of parties and whatever? Chris Watts becoming, let's just take it further, Chris Watts becomes more and more introverted, Shanann becomes more and more extroverted. Maybe Shanann somehow controls the finances or whatever, Chris Watts becomes this sort of pathetic figure, and Shanann becomes this strong figure, but she's not very happy with the spineless guy that she's with. What do you think she would do? Do you think she would divorce him? Do you think she would cheat on him? Just something to think about. I find it hard to imagine that, and I don't mean this to knock Shanann at all. I'm almost just thinking of them as a generic couple. If Chris Watts didn't cheat on Shanann, eventually, if he just sort of stayed loyal for whatever reason, wouldn't Shanann have left him or cheated on him or divorced him? Wasn't that sort of written in the stars? Because weren't they incompatible, basically? Bearing in mind her health challenges, and he doesn't have any health challenges. Wow, okay, so we're 11 minutes in. I think we should start with today's episode, and it is July 22nd, 2018. The post that I posted about a year ago is titled Arguments, and I think that is really, that sums up July 22nd, which is 2 years ago today. We're going to go into the timeline. We know for a fact that Nutgate soured relations between the couple, but that couldn't have been all. We also know for a fact that Watts' affair meant he was disinterested because he was distracted. If Nutgate hadn't happened, Shanann would have had a clearer idea that something else was brewing, something that was less her doing. But besides these hypotheticals, it's likely the couple argued about money. This aspect is sequestrated from all the correspondence, but just because it isn't there is hardly evidence that it wasn't a serious issue. Perhaps Watts felt embarrassed and ashamed that he'd allowed himself and her to get them into such a desperate financial situation again. This was also the one aspect he didn't really discuss with Nicole Kessinger. I just want to emphasize that. This was also the one aspect he didn't really discuss with Nicole Kessinger, even though he felt he could be himself and talk to her about anything. Well, not this. Not the first bankruptcy and not the second. And if you think about it in a general way, why would a man not want to talk to a woman that he's attracted to about his true financial situation? Why would a man not want to reveal the true financial ruin he's facing with a young woman that seems to like him and seems to think that he's more successful than he really is? I think the reason is obvious. It's because he's worried that if she knew, she wouldn't really be interested in him. Women are interested in security, but they're also interested in a strong man who can manage his affairs. Women are attracted to power, not necessarily like, someone who's the president, but someone who has dominion over their own life, someone who has a sense of control and agency over their own life, right? That's attractive in any person. Any person that is really independent is attractive. Although you do get people who are attracted to vulnerable or dependent people, and that's often weak people who are attracted to people like that. I recently read a criminal profile of this suspect in the Madeleine McCann case. I don't believe he is the abductor. I don't believe there was an abduction. But what is interesting with the criminal profile of him was someone was saying he was attracted to, he was a pedophile, but he was also liked raping an old lady. And the criminal profiler was saying they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Whether it's a very old lady or a very young child, it's still a vulnerable person that he feels he's got power over, and that's what's I guess, turning him on. And then he says this is a turn on for him because he, in a very deep part of himself, feels powerless, feels that he lacks agency. And when you go into Bruckner's backstory, it turns out that he was adopted, that, you know, his mother gave him away. I think his mother was a drug addict. And then when he was 15 years old, his adoptive parents gave him away. So if you've been rejected by two sets of parents and you've got no anchor in your life, you are probably going to feel powerless, helpless, confused, and all that kind of thing. Insignificant. Right? And I want to compare that to an extent where Shanann suddenly went through a crisis where her health spiraled. She was not healthy in high school anyway, but she then went through a really dark patch where her health really deteriorated. And then Chris Watts came along and was kind to her. And the fact that he was so kind despite her not being in this amazing, how can I put it? She's not like a princess. She's kind of like a weak or a weakened or a sickly person. And he cares for her. He arranges her medication, all that kind of thing. And because he's such a sweetheart, she feels like, wow, he's the best thing that's ever happened to me. On the other hand, you could say Chris Watts is a really weak man himself. He couldn't stand up for himself. He couldn't talk for himself. And so there was a kind of a mutual dependency with Chris Watts and Shanann. But then 6 years later, they'd both matured somewhat into more independent people. Does that make sense? Anyway, in terms of Kessinger, Watts didn't want to admit that he didn't really have any money. And Kessinger, I think, was initially attracted to the veneer. I think she saw the pictures of the Watts home, the Watts family, and she liked it and she was envious. She liked that whole postcard. She wanted that kind of picture postcard for herself. And Watts couldn't bring it to tell her, well, that it was actually very little of it, very small amount of it was actually true. I think towards the end she did realize that the house, that he couldn't afford the house. But by then I think she was maybe addicted to the sex as much as he was or something like that. If we go to the discovery, it's in terms of Kessinger's interview, she says Chris never discussed his bankruptcy with Nicole. He said Shanann spends most of the money. He was frustrated Shanann had bad spending habits. Nicole thought the Lexus was Shanann's. Nicole didn't think they owned any other cars. Chris had his Anadarko truck but cannot drive it when not at work. He said Shanann wanted everyone to think they lived a certain way and they could not afford it. He was never mean or hostile when he mentioned it. Another thing that I think's worth mentioning is this idea that in the same way where you say Shanann was Chris Watts' first girlfriend, but Shanann had lots of boyfriends. In other words, that's a myth. In the same way, I think the idea that Shanann wasn't very good with money, but Chris Watts was amazing with money, I don't think that's true either. I think in the same way, Chris Watts was maybe better with money than Shanann, but still not very good. And what I mean is, very close to the time that the murders were committed, he was going to buy an Audi, it looked like. I think he was searching for a kind of Audi. And I think what he was thinking was he was going to give the Lexus back or something, sell the house, and he was going to buy an Audi. He couldn't really afford that car either. So he was also kind of living beyond his means. But he's probably thinking that Kessinger would be impressed by the Audi. Does that make sense? So if we go further, there may have been a verbal and emotional feedback loop between Kessinger and Watts and Shanann, specifically on the issue of the best way to resolve the financial trouble. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Shanann doesn't know Kessinger's in the picture, but Kessinger is in the picture. Watts might be confiding to an extent, a limited extent, as he gets to know, as he gets to trust her, more and more that, okay, there are a few problems, Shanann's spending a lot of money. Kessinger might be giving him some advice. Kessinger might actually be giving him some sound advice. Watts then may apply some of that advice to Shanann. In other words, Kessinger's advising Watts on how to control the finances, control the spending, and Watts is relaying that, but maybe euphemistically and with a little bit of interpretation, to Shanann. We're going to need to stop spending. We're going to need to do this. We're going to need to do that. And Shanann may not have liked that, or Shanann may have said, where does this come from? Why do you want to change that? Don't tell me what to do, or whatever. Or Shanann may have said, I need you to get this. I need you to go to Home Depot and get that. And Watts said, no, we can't afford it. What are you talking about? We can't afford it. Says who? He's not going to say, says Kessinger. So I'm just saying there may have been a verbal and emotional feedback loop where between Kessinger and Watts and Shanann. But Shanann wasn't aware that it was Kessinger that was now in this feedback loop. She may have thought, well, is it because of what I said to your parents? And bear in mind, she's also pregnant and she's trying to thrive. She's trying to show the world a happy face. So she's not fully concentrating on reading Watts' mind. If Watts was blissfully unaware or woefully ignorant of the finances, I'm talking about prior to the 5-6 week trip, I think his affair with Kessinger forced the issue on two fronts. Now, to be clear, I don't actually think he was totally unaware of it. I mean, they were bankrupt in 2015. Shanann's parents came to stay with him for was it 15 months? So I don't think he was blissfully unaware of it. If you're saying, well, they went bankrupt, but then they recovered, and then they kind of were on their way to bankruptcy again, was he blissfully unaware the second time? I think there was unawareness, but then I also think he just didn't know what to do about it. He just felt like he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to change it. But I also think there's an extent that he wasn't aware of the extent of the financial debacle. And I think when she left, to some extent, that scale and scope of it was revealed. In any event, I think his affair with Kessinger forced the issue. In other words, forced him to bear in mind, Chris Watts is someone who runs away from dealing with stuff, right? He doesn't want to be in control. He wants to go with the flow. It'll just sort itself out, kind of thing. But his affair with Kessinger forced the issue being dealing with the finances, and on two fronts. Firstly, he would need an additional budget to woo her, right? So if it didn't really matter if he didn't have that much money, well, if he wanted to keep Kessinger, he would need money to pay for restaurants, because he was the kind of guy who felt like the guy must pay. If I want to go to that restaurant, I'm going to also have to be able to pay for her, right? So that is quite an incentive, I can tell you. If you don't have money and you're really attracted to someone and you feel like you've got to maintain her, that is going to lift a guy's game. And I think it did. So this would make him far more hands-on about the finances. How much do I really have? I need more money. And this was a month of wooing. This was a month of going to restaurants, a month of this and that and that. We don't know what gifts he bought her or whatever, but we know he was Googling jewelry and so on. Anyway, needing this additional budget to woo her would reinforce the knowledge and urgency of just how cash-strapped he really was. So if he was like, to give a dumb example, if he thought, well, I really want to buy her a bouquet of flowers, and found that there was no money in the bank just for some small transaction like that, he may have really panicked, like, well, I don't have any money. Where's all my money going? What is it going to? And why was he cash-strapped? What was going on? Whose fault was it? What should he do about it? What could he do to stop this hemorrhage? He had to woo her, and how was he going to do that? And when Shanann came back to Colorado, how was he going to do that? How was he going to do that if she was there? How was he going to sort of take away little sections of the funds of the kitty without Shanann noticing? He wasn't going to be able to do that. You might be able to do that when you have a lot of money, but not when you have a little. Secondly, as Kessinger became more familiar with Watts' untenable situation, she may have provided him with sensible advice on how to manage his finances. I've already touched on that. But if he applied her advice, like if she said, you can't afford this, you shouldn't be doing that, blah, 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 that would mean managing or in some way manipulating or controlling Shanann. In other words, changing the dynamic. Shanann was used to managing everything, controlling everything. But now Watts is saying, no, we can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that. We don't know whether Shanann's response when he said something like that was, nonsense, of course we can. Don't tell me what to do. We can have whatever we want. Don't tell me what we can't have, or something like that. And so maybe he did try to reason with her, and maybe she didn't want to be reasoned with. I'm not sure if I believe that, because I think Shanann did understand and realize that they were going to have to move out of their home, and I think she was resigned to doing it. So I don't know if she if a conversation about the finances would have been that strange to her. I think she was aware of it, but at the same time I think she was also keeping it a secret. I think that was part of the whole Thrive bullshit, was look at our amazing house that we actually, and then in brackets, that we actually can't afford. Look at my amazing car, in brackets, that I actually can't afford. Look at me on this trip, in brackets, that I actually can't afford. Look at me with these new nails. Look at this, look at that, in brackets, every single time, that I actually can't afford. Look at me having another child, in brackets, that I actually can't afford. And so that same sort of thing where Shanann is pretending that it's all great and that she's living large. Remember what the detective said. He immediately stepped inside the house and said, I was under the impression that these people were living beyond their means. Not just Shanann, Chris Watts as well. Chris Watts having an affair was also him living beyond his means. Anyway, if he applied Kessinger's advice, would that mean managing Shanann? Reigning or regaining financial control meant necessarily exerting control over Shanann, or trying to. And that's the part that we don't really know. Did he try to regain control over Shanann or over the finances? And what is her response? There is kind of a broad answer to that, and that's basically the fact that they were going to have a third child just shows how idiotic it was from both sides. Their finances were an absolute mess, and yet they both, it takes two to tango. Whether it was Chris's idea or Shanann's idea to have the third child, they conceived a third child. Whether Chris changed his mind immediately or not, it doesn't really matter. The fact that they both consented to having this third child at the time that they had the third child shows what how idiotic their approach was to their own finances, to their own family management. As most couples know, when marriages break down, the wrestle for control over money becomes, if not a life and death struggle, ugly and filled with ploys, dirty tricks, and shenanigans. In the previous episode, I spoke about have you ever heard of a divorce being a fairy tale? Well, one of the key areas that people fight tooth and nail over is money. So when the marriage breaks down, it really all comes down to money. Who gets what? Who gets what, and also who gets what as a monthly allowance, and how much is it, right? If you feel like someone has been the death of you, in other words, if you've been in a marriage and then you get divorced, and it feels like death, it feels like every time you deal with this toxic person, it's killing you, then the money adds insult to injury. The fact that you must give this person that you despise money, money is both a symptom of life, it's like stored up life energy, but it's also like a way to transcend excrement, if that makes sense. So if you don't have money, you almost like scrabble in the gutter. But if you have money, then it allows you to transcend that. And so you want to get that from another person. And in a divorce situation, that person doesn't necessarily, they want to escape the gutter. They don't necessarily want you to escape it. They just want what they want. Anyway, let's go to the timeline. And it does seem to be a little bit about that there might be spite, nitpicking, baiting, naming and shaming, whatever. The stuff that goes into bickering in a marriage. That's something that we have never seen. We've never seen or heard Chris Watts and Shanann going at each other, calling each other names, just both getting angry with one another. And are you telling me that they never did? I mean, all couples argue. On July 22nd at 8 minutes to 8, Watts called Shanann. Now, I think whenever he calls her, there's kind of a loaded atmosphere. I think if he can possibly get away with it, he doesn't call her. She calls him, she calls him, she calls him. I think when he calls her, it's because he's pissed off about something. It's because something is bugging him. He's not calling her to say, I miss you. He's not calling her to say, let's FaceTime with the kids. He's not calling her to say, I've been thinking about the baby. He's calling to confront something, or to complain about something, or to try to control something. Wouldn't it be the finances? Shanann calls him, so they talk for 12 minutes. Shanann calls him back afterwards, and they have another 14-minute conversation. Now, I think it's fair to assume that whenever you have this one person calls, they speak for quite a while, and then the conversation ends, and then a short while later someone calls back, and then they talk for another length of time. I think it's fair to assume when that is happening that it's a heated conversation. I'm not talking about phoning back 2 hours later or in the afternoon. I'm talking about speaking for about 10, 20 minutes. The call ends, and then immediately after that they speak another 10, 15 minutes. That tends to be about an argument. You could have, when people love each other, that kind of thing, where you talk and then you phone back again. I forgot to tell you that I really blah, 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 blah. But those conversations tend to go on, they can go on for hours. So this is arguing. About an hour later at 0900, Watts searched Google for a Home Depot. near him in Broomfield. Now, I've got no idea what that was about, but it feels like it had something to do with chores. Did he need to still sort out the basement? Did he need to pack things? Was Shanann telling him there's going to be, after this local, I've just made a big order of Thrive stuff. We need to put it in containers, I don't know, whatever. But it could be quite a few different things. Did she want him to go to Home Depot to buy kind of a baby's crib? Did she want him to go and buy baby's clothes? What was he doing at Home Depot? That's just a simple thing that it would be good if he was asked this by the detectives, by the FBI. Why did you go to Home Depot on July the 22nd? Did Shanann ask you to go? Now we go to, I think it's page 2091 of Discovery. It's page 11 of the phone data review. I think, yeah. And we're now in the afternoon, 13:48. What search Google for Spanish dancing near me? Red wine made in Argentina and the Cheesecake Factory. Those three searches sort of show where his heart is. He wants to go dancing with Kessinger. He wants to drink wine with her. He wants to go and eat perhaps at the Cheesecake Factory. He wants to enjoy his weekend with her. He wants to enjoy his time with her. When he speaks to Shanann, it's banal arguments about money and go to Home Depot and get me this. When he thinks about Kessinger, it's totally different. It's about getting away. It's about escaping. It's about a fairy tale. It's about butterflies flying in formation in his stomach. It's about finding himself. It's about somebody listening when he's got something to say. It's about talking to someone and wanting to hear what they've got to say in response, not wanting to hear it. It's about hanging on every word and that person apparently hanging on to your every word. Then about an hour and a half after that, at 15:25, Shanann called Watts and held an 18-minute conversation. Then she called back again and held an additional 21-minute conversation. So I don't know what he was doing on this day, but Shanann spent a long time talking to him. We have no idea whether he went to the Home Depot on July 22nd, and if he did, what he got there. Did it have anything to do with Shanann or Kessinger? The Discovery case file lists 14 instances of Home Depot in its 1,960 pages. On page 945, a USB drive from Home Depot is listed. This may indicate that Watts or Shanann wanted information on a shared computer in a safe place, probably the former, probably Watts. Anyway, we can speculate till the cows come home. In total, Watts and Shanann spoke for 65 minutes on July 22nd, a record. Again, bear in mind, I'm not sure if Watts really had that much to say. Shanann probably spoke most of the time. Now, the trouble with viewing the case in hindsight, simply glancing backwards to the rearview mirror, is that the weight of our perception is just that, a lightweight glance. When we go through the timeline systematically, pacing ourselves in real time as we are now, we can see how the weight of the finances wasn't just a factor, it was a daily burden. If you go to the CBI report, I think this is I'm not 100% sure if this is from the Discovery from 2018 or the CBI report from the visit to the prison in February. But in any event, it's from the Discovery. I think it's from the original Discovery from 2018. just think about this as a background to what is going on every day. He and Shanann filed for bankruptcy 2 years earlier. It's actually 3 years. It was 2015. The murders happened in 2018, so that's actually an error. He does not recall how much was discharged during the bankruptcy. So much for Rain Man knowing what was going on. He knew when the kids returned to school that they would be living paycheck to paycheck. That's huge. That is huge. In other words, he knew on Monday the 13th, when the kids returned to school, they were scheduled to return to school then. He lied during the sermon on the porch saying, Bella, I think, and he sort of stutters when he says this, I think Bella is going to start kindergarten next Monday. It was supposed to be that Monday. He knew that day, the day of the murders, he was going to be back to living paycheck to paycheck. He didn't want that. If he could get rid of everybody, Shanann, the unborn child, and the kids, he wouldn't be living paycheck to paycheck. So killing his family was a little bit like turning oil into gold, or turning bodies into oil and oil into gold, if that makes sense. He was more interested in the gold and the glittering fairy tale. Shanann recently took out, so I think it's just important to emphasize here that is why the murders happened when they did. That's why they happened on that Monday. Because the moment everyone arrived home, he would have no money. The moment they arrived home, he wouldn't be able to continue his affair with Kessinger, just in terms of wining and dining her. I mean, I don't know how he would have kept it secret. I don't know how he would have done it on the side. But I think he knew better than anyone that he just wouldn't be able to afford it. And that's why the money is such an important aspect. But think of it in a different way. What if what didn't kill his family then? You know, couldn't he have waited till the next weekend when they went to Aspen? Couldn't he have done it just some other time? I think the other aspect is the fact that the pregnancy reveal was about to happen, which was going to show that they weren't about to get divorced. They weren't unhappily married. Bear in mind, the pregnancy reveal was on, then it was off, and at the time that Shanann was murdered, it was on again. So that the pregnancy reveal, not the pregnancy reveal, the gender reveal was floating in the air, and I think it was actually going to happen that Monday online. It was going to be like a gender reveal party online. I know some of you will say, no, I think it was going to happen that weekend. Yes, originally. It was originally going to be one day, then it was cancelled. And then Shanann talked Chris Watts into marriage counselling, I think. And I know he said no in the beginning, but I think she talked him into it. She sort of got him back on board, but all of that, of course, was a ruse. He was pretending that it was okay. But also the pregnancy reveal, the gender reveal was back on the cards. He couldn't afford for that gender reveal to go ahead. Because as I say, it would reveal to Kessinger that at least Shanann thought she was still happily married. You could also argue that she would have found out about the pregnancy. Possibly. Maybe she knew about the pregnancy but thought someone else was the father. Maybe that was the story that he told her. But I'm just saying there's a reason why they were murdered when they were murdered. I think the one has got to do with money. I think the other one has got to do with the gender reveal, what that was going to reveal. That's something very few people talk about. Then there's also, Shanann recently took out a $10,000 loan from his 401k to catch up on their mortgage payments. I've heard even till now, people and I don't know whether these people genuinely believe it or that they pretend to believe it or that they are also MLMers or that they're also just bullshitters. But even now, 2 years later, people still saying Shanann made just as much money as he did. Shanann made more money than he did. He was a useless guy. He was actually riding her coattails. She was a businesswoman. She was successful. Oh, so why did she take $10,000 from his 401k? If she was so successful, why did she take money from his 401k? Why were they 3 months behind on their mortgage payments even after she'd done that? So the loan against his 401k was taken out 5 months earlier, but they were still 3 months behind on their mortgage payments during the murders. So what happened to that money? I have an idea some of that money was meant to boost Shanann's business, that some of that money was meant to pay for the whatever that went into the whole Thrive promotion in North Carolina. In other words, she took that money to invest in her business, which is another way of saying I'm not saying she took all of that money and invested all that money in her business. I'm saying she probably may have spent a little bit of that money on the mortgage, maybe 2 mortgage payments, and then maybe the balance was used for as kind of, I don't know, spending money or investment money in her business. I don't know. But the point is, she got it from him. Why couldn't she have used her own money? Why couldn't they have sort of split it or something like that? I don't know. They had received a letter from Chase Bank pertaining to their delinquent home loan. He and Shanann were stressed out about their financial situation. He says he and Shanann were stressed out about their financial situation. Well, you don't really get that sense from her. She talks about on Facebook, she's just talking about how blessed she is and how great things are. He currently owes his mortgage payment for August 2018, which is due tomorrow. That's August the 16th. Do you think he ever paid that last mortgage payment? I don't think so. He currently has $2,000 in his Chase checking account and approximately $1,500 in their USAA checking account. What is going to happen to that money? Well, to pay for the girl's schooling, I think that was gonna go into Primrose School. Some of that money. How much of that money was going to pay for the birth of their 3rd child and going to the doctor? Almost all of their credit cards are maxed out. Shanann had only been paying the minimum payment on their credit cards. This is magical thinking, where you think we are in debt up to our ears, but if we keep telling people how successful we are, we'll suddenly have money. Now, I don't want to sort of rain on anyone's parade, because my own father was a property developer. He spent quite a long time working like hell, and he just wasn't making any money, right? And I want to compare this to what was happening with the Watts family. He's a good businessman. He's a savvy guy, but he was working and working, and he just wasn't making any money. And he eventually found out that someone working for him was stealing money from him, and eventually he caught the guy out, and I think took the guy to court, and he in terms of restitution, he won a house. In other words, the guy couldn't pay him money, but he got the guy's house, because that was the equivalent in money that had been stolen from him. I can tell you more about that story, but the point is, where you don't know the true nuts and bolts of your finances because maybe you're not using an accountant or something. So my father may have thought, well, if I just keep working hard, I'll eventually sort of not keep my head above water. I will eventually be okay, right? In other words, I'm just going to work, and eventually things are going to be fine. I kind of get that impression that's what Shanann was trying to do. Just like, I'm not quite sure what my exact finances are, but if I just, work hard, it's going to work itself out. If I just get enough clients and sign up enough people, it's got to pay off. And I think my father had the same thing. But when someone is there taking their little cut all the time, secretly, seditiously, he never made any money for quite a long time until he caught this guy out. So you've got to be in control of your finances. You've got to know what's going on. Watts and Shanann were unequally yoked. He was the one saddled with the mortgage. The house was in his name this time. And they were almost certainly going to lose the house regardless of the arrival of a third child. We don't know when Watts received word from Chase Manhattan Bank regarding their home loan, but we do know on June 30th, 3 weeks earlier in the timeline, Watts may have forged Shanann's signature on these documents. Now you can look at the signature there. It just doesn't look like a proper signature. To me it looks forged. And also if you look at that date, dated 30th day of June, doesn't that look like Watts' handwriting? I've looked at Watts' handwriting. That does look like the way he writes. Shanann wasn't home on the 30th of June. And so I say it's likely a forgery simply because Shanann was already in North Carolina on June 30th. Regardless, Watts was also listed as a defendant on the summons. The summons was received and filed by Weld County on the morning of July 12th. And Watts was the one collecting mail while Shanann was away. You can see this on the passenger seat of the Lexus. You can see the mail. There was also a lot of mail in Shanann's office. Now you can also imagine the mail piling up, the bills piling up, and Watts kind of running away from them every night going to Kessinger. And he is kind of running away from his life. He's running away from his bills. But they're there. Every time he comes home, he sees them, and when he sees them, he thinks of Shanann. When he thinks of dealing with them, he thinks of dealing with Shanann. Besides, and it's maybe the first time that he ever sort of saw it all in one go and realized, just by seeing the number of these bills, realized the extent of it. Besides this aspect, if we look at the crime scene, what stood out in a relatively pristine, innocuous-looking crime scene overall was this, and this is a quote from the Discovery. CSA Yoakum took overall photographs of the residence, and we then began our search. I noted that the residence was very neat and orderly. The items in the kitchen cupboard were organized and labeled. The items in the basement were all organized and packaged, many in plastic totes. I noted that the clothing in the closets were neat and orderly, arranged by clothing type and color. The only exception, and this is with emphasis, the only exception was the office and its adjoining closet, which had clutter on the desk and items strewn on the floor. The office and closet were in contrast to the remainder of the house. I noted that all of the beds had been made, as I was advised that on previous consent searches of the residence the kids' beds were unmade and the master bedroom bed was stripped of its bedding. Now it's possible that Nicholas Atkinson and Nicole Atkinson had made created the disarray in the office, but I think there was already clutter there based on all the mail that had arrived as well. My point is just that what was happening in the office was different to the neat and orderliness of the rest of the house. And that's showing that actual disarray. In other words, that's the other face of the Watts family, of the Watts finances, of the thriving fairy tale. Shanann did mention, and we'll get to that in the timeline review, she did mention that Choran trashed her office, or that it could be, or that maybe she's worried that Choran would do that. So it may not be that Watts threw things around, or that Watts was sort of disgusted, or whatever, or that Shanann left it like that. But the fact is that that was how the office looked. I mean, it could also be that Watts went through it looking for bills, familiarizing himself with their their true financial situation. I don't think so, though. I don't think Watts would leave. Sorry, I don't think Watts would leave the office in a state that, if Shanann saw it, this is before she went to Arizona. I don't think he would leave her office untidy and then she would be pissed off with him for messing up her office. I just don't think he would do that. I don't think he would put himself into that situation willingly or knowingly. At 12:30 on the 22nd, Watts told Shanann, Jen, McKenna and Kylie are coming to watch the girls for a few hours while I go to that Rockies game. Shanann asked him to ensure they don't feed Celeste anything she can't eat. She also asked Watts, will you lock my office? And this is just a reference to the mess and the clutter. Her saying, will you lock my office because of these people coming? And Watts answered definitely. Watts' discovery of the paper trail while Shanann was away was likely an intermittent process, but with each successive discovery was a more startling revelation of the seriousness and sheer scale of the debt tsunami advancing towards them. With each discovery, it became necessary to call his co-accused to discuss their debt mess. This would be followed by an inevitable blame game, along with perhaps a hastily cobbled strategy to deal with or postpone the next large payment. Their biggest financial millstone was the mortgage, $2,700 going off at the middle of each month, or supposed to. That amount that we saw in Watts' account, those amounts for $2,000 and I think $1,500, was some of that going to go towards the mortgage, or were they going to sort of defer the mortgage yet again and be 4 months behind on the mortgage? You either pay your mortgage and have no money, or don't pay your mortgage and you can take your girlfriend out for a couple of meals. When was the family murdered? Just prior to the middle of the month. July was the second or third month they were behind in paying it. If it was the third, then June was the second and May the first. This suggests the moment they could no longer pay their mortgage was around the time Shanann fell pregnant. Well, this is a long post. Anyway, we almost finished. Shanann's trip to North Carolina was possibly a last-ditch effort to turn around to refloat their shipwrecked finances. But by investing all her hope and efforts into the MLM maelstrom, she was giving herself and her family a 0.4% chance of success. So there was still a chance, right? You can go into the blog post on Crime Rocket 2 to see what that 0.4% chance of success hyperlinks to. You can go and check that out. I'm not going to explain it here just because we're almost at an hour. But historically, MLMs have very low rates of success. It's possible during July, Watts quietly evaluated not so much his own ability to turn around their finances, but whether Shanann was capable. In other words, if he stayed with Shanann, whether there was any chance that they were going to turn any of this around. By late July, it was becoming clear that they weren't, and worse, that they were losing control, that he was losing control. If Shanann wanted everyone to think they lived a certain way, that was certainly about to end. Okay, we're about at the hour mark. Once again, if you want to read this on your own, sort of studying it, there's a really good post with all of it together and some images on Crime Rocket 2. I'll put the link in the description as usual. I want to thank the approximately 50 patrons now that have moved over to Patreon. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the 100 or so people who have subscribed since the last video or two. Thank you for that. I'll be back tomorrow with July 23rd, which is the penultimate episode on this channel before it all moves to Patreon. On the 25th, the hashtag 2 years ago today CW series will be moved to Patreon on the $1 tier. So if you haven't signed up there yet, please do. I'll also put the link to Patreon in the description. It's Patreon/TCRS. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.